Hello kids, we are back with, I had to conclude this poem, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and I'll try and do that today. But before I do that, let me just recapitulate things for you. Let me just jog your memory a bit. So yesterday we started with this poem. We did the first two verses, or the first two stanzas, where the first stanza was the poet drew in words a very evocative picture, a very good picture of a bird flying in the sky and gliding downstream till the point where the current of water ended, and how the free bird claimed the sky as its own. Remember that the free bird is a metaphor for the white Americans living in America. So the first verse can be seen as the white American living in a system that promotes his welfare and also gives him ample opportunities for him to grow to his full potential. And the first stanza also talks about the availability of resources for him, because he dares to claim the sky, number one. Number two is that it also talks about the ease with which, or the favorable circumstances that he has in order to achieve his desired goals and his desired aims. Then we moved on to the second stanza, which was in direct contrast to the first stanza, where there is this image drawn of a caged bird whose wings are clipped, whose feet are tied, and it has recourse it has no one's willing to listen to it, and it is trapped, it feels confined. And I also told you that the caged bird is a metaphor for the Afro-Americans living in America, and it also speaks about their condition. And remember that if you imprison any living creature that is alive, that has life, it's very unnatural for living creatures to be confined or to be imprisoned, regardless of the species. Even if you confine a man, even if you can confine an animal, it is an unnatural condition for both the man as well as the animal. So we also, I also spoke a bit about the history of the Afro-Americans, because it's very important for us to understand where is it that the Afro-Americans come from. So we spoke about it in brief, not at length, and so now I would like to continue with the next few stanzas. And so I would also like to tell you that the first two stanzas are in contrast to each other, and the figure of speech that has been used here is this figure of speech called juxtaposition, where ideas, places, concepts, themes, sometimes themes are placed next to each other or are placed side by side to emphasize something, to highlight something, or for the readers to compare and contrast those two things. If you all have access to the internet, so I will, so for example, I can give you one example of juxtaposition. I can, so if you say a line like everything is fair in love and war. So love and war are two, so I have placed these two opposing concepts side by side in order to put forth the point that everything is fair in love and war. And plus there are other examples as well. In Shakespeare's Othello, you have Othello's dark Moorish skin juxtaposed to Desdemona's Venetian fair skin, and likewise there are a lot of examples of juxtaposition. And so throughout this poem there is a very effective use of juxtaposition, where you have the joy and the freedom that the free bird enjoys is juxtaposed to the frustration that the encaged bird feels. Okay, so just remember that point, and we move on. So the third stanza goes on like this. So the caged bird sings with fearful trill. So now the word trill means a shrill voice. So now we look at the word fearful. So fearful, if you look up the dictionary, fearful means frightened trill. Now, why frightened in the sense, frightened trill of things unknown but longed for still? So in your workbooks, probably in your guidebooks, what they've spoken about is how the caged bird, despite being caged, despite being imprisoned, it has the agency of its voice. So that's something, its urge or its desire for freedom, freedom that it has never known before. The urge to be free runs deep in its blood, runs deep in its soul, and there is no power in the world that can stop it from singing, from voicing its hunger for freedom. And also not only its hunger for freedom, but it's also a voice. This bird's song is a voice against oppression. It's a voice against racism. It's a voice, it's a plea, it's an appeal, it's an urge against discrimination. So it can be looked at in these two ways. So the caged bird sings with fearful trill of things unknown, in the sense it has not known what freedom tastes like. It has not known what freedom feels like. So unlike the free bird that's joyous, that's full of happiness because it is in its natural habitat, unlike that, man, or in this case the Afro-American, has been placed in this confined cage. Confined cage, again, remember, it's a metaphor for the systems, the political, the economic systems that are in place that do not allow the Afro-American to blossom, to become himself, to give shape to his innate potential. So, the caged bird sings with fearful trill of things unknown because it has never tasted freedom before. It does not know it does not know what to make of freedom. So that is the interpretation that you get in your books, but I would like to look at it in a different way because the word fearful means frightened trill. So trill is a shrill sound that's made. So fearful in the sense, remember we've spoken in brief about the history of the Afro-Americans. So despite them being granted equal citizenship by the US Constitution, despite them being granted voting rights by the US Constitution, but despite that, a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination still prevailed or still existed in American society. So even when you talk about voting rights, they were guaranteed voting rights by the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution, but despite that, especially in the South, the southern half of America, they were not encouraged to vote. The Afro-Americans were not encouraged to vote, and many of them were poor and they were illiterate. So when they used to go and try and vote, literacy tests were conducted. So obviously they used to fail the literacy tests, because of which again they could not vote. And not only this, but if any Afro-American tried to assert his rights or tried to speak against discrimination or tried to voice his opposition to the white oppression, there was something that prevailed in American society that actually is a blotch, that actually is a black mark, that actually is a stain on American democracy. And here I'm referring to something called lynching, where mobs of white people over some minor infraction or some perceived minor offense of the black man used to go in mobs, and they used to burn the house of the black man, and they used to drag him all the way to some jungle or probably some place, and they used to hang him, and they used to torture him, they used to burn him. And this was like a public spectacle, in the sense this was something that normal people, everyday people took part in. So you had lawyers as a part of the mob, lawyers, school teachers, laborers, mechanics. So people working in different professions, your everyday normal people used to take part in these lynchings, and they used to take photographs of the torture and the charred bodies of the Afro-Americans, and they used to make postcards out of it. They used to, as in they have also been cases of the mutilated bodies of these Afro-Americans being used as souvenirs. And so there was always this threat of violence against Afro-Americans who spoke against the system and who spoke against the discrimination that they faced at the hands of their white counterparts or their fellow Americans, their fellow white Americans. So fearful trill in the sense there is a certain amount of fear in the bird, there is a certain amount of fear in the Afro-American to voice its opposition, because obviously it has had a history of people trying to prevent, that have tried to prevent it from speaking out, and they've used different means, primarily violence. So this element of fear is there, but despite the element of fear, regardless of this fear, the bird chooses to sing. Okay, the bird chooses to sing. The bird chooses to surrender itself to its deep desire for freedom. So now that's now when you talk about freedom in the sense, what gives the white man or what gives any person the right to imprison another living creature? Or to, so at least here you have the bird, as we know that the bird is encaged. But in America, there are systems in place where the discrimination is not out in the open, but there are several ways in which one can discriminate against another person. So okay, fine, let's move on. So the caged bird sings with fearful trill of things unknown, but longed for still. So though it does not know what freedom tastes like, but despite that it chooses to sing, chooses to voice its opposition. So this particular poem can also be seen as a political poem by Maya Angelou. And before I forget, this particular poem was published in the year 1983. So this particular poem can be seen as a political protest against the injustices prevailing in the American system against the Afro-Americans, especially the Afro-Americans. Okay, we have to look at this poem, okay, in that context. But if you talk about oppression, you can also expand the theme, we'll talk about that later. But this thing about oppressed people wanting freedom is something that exists throughout the world across timelines. Even when the British were there in India, we hungered for freedom. And likewise, there are so many oppressed communities all over the world who hunger for freedom, who hunger to be released from their chains. The chains could be visible, the chains could be invisible, but they want that release. They want to live lives of dignity. And so this particular poem, as we read in the subsequent lines, and its tune is heard on the distant hill. So this voice, this very, very powerful voice is heard in the distant hills by other people who hunger, who yearn to be free. So this particular song of the bird and by the bird, it serves as an inspiration for other oppressed communities, for them to rise up against their oppressors and demand justice, demand equality, and demand how can there be freedom without equality? And so you have to look at it this way. So, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. So, freedom, as Moshe Dayan had said, freedom is the oxygen of the soul. So, freedom is something that is every individual's inalienable right. He is born with that right. If someone or an institution, even governments, can take away freedom from its citizens, you can see what's happening in North Korea. The government of North Korea has actually oppressed its people to serve its own interest. So this poem has a lot of relevance because we still have oppressed communities all over the world. You can think about the Rohingyas, the way they are being treated. So this poem does have its relevance, and so let me just move on to the next verse. So the free bird thinks of another breeze, and the trade wind soft to the sighing tree. So the free bird, remember, it has glided downstream, so now it's chosen to fly with another kind of wind. Okay, that's the trade wind, and obviously, and the trade wind soft to the sighing trees. So you have the trees, and when the wind blows past or blows through the trees make this soft sound, this sigh. That's a sigh. So these trees make a soft sound. So out here, if you look at it, sighing, S-I-G-H-I-N-G, sighing trees, this is an example of personification, because human beings, we are the ones who actually sigh. So this human quality has been given to a tree, or trees in this case, and trees are obviously inanimate beings. So sighing trees is an example of personification. So the free bird is, next line that we have is, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn bright lawn. So birds, obviously they eat worms, but here we have to see that obviously it's clearly mentioned out here that the noun worms is preceded by the adjective fat. So it's not only about, so the free bird in the sky not only has access to worms, but it actually has access to fat worms. So this clearly indicates the rich opportunities that's available for the free bird in the sky, and likewise there are a lot of plum good opportunities available for the white American. So, and the fat worms waiting on a dawn bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. So again, in this particular verse, we see that the free bird has the element of choice. It can choose to fly with different sorts of breezes. It can choose to fly all over the sky, so it is not limited. And then you have the fat worms waiting on a dawn bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. And plus, these lines go on to clearly indicate that the white American has a lot of good opportunities waiting for him. There is nothing to stop him from achieving all that he desires to achieve. Okay, we'll move on. Kids, another thing is I will make this, now I will compress it, or I will make it brief because of a few things, and when you return from home, I'll expand on it a bit more. So now we move on to the next line. Again, there's this contrast here. Remember, I've already spoken about juxtaposition. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. It's not that the bird that's there in the cage, so he's confined within a space. His physical movement is restricted. He cannot move beyond the cage. But not only that, if you actually put a system in place that does not allow people to grow to their full potential, then it tends to affect them mentally as well. It tends to affect them psychologically as well. So the Afro-American is not only his opportunities are restricted. There is a system that discriminates against him, that treats him like a second-class citizen. Not only that, but also because of the system prevailing in America, because of the fact that America is not truly a society which one could consider equal. That's the reason why the Afro-Americans, psychology too is not positive. It's not healthy. And he names the sky his own. But despite the bird being affected psychologically, the bird being affected physically by the visible bars of the cage and the invisible bars of certain rules, certain norms, certain prejudices prevailing in society, so the Afro-American can't quite get what he wants, can't quite achieve his goals. But despite that, remember, the enslaved bird, the bird that's there in the cage, it chooses to fight, it chooses to speak aloud its dissatisfaction with the state of things. So one can't quite crush the bird's or the Afro-American spirit. But this is a these are lines that probably beautifully captures the pain of the Afro-American. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams in this grave. So here you have the word grave, and here so grave is basically, it's associated with death. So here we have this imagery of death. So but a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams in the sense, grave of unfulfilled dreams. There is so much perhaps that could have been achieved by a talented Afro-American, but because of certain problems with the system, certain inbuilt rules or certain inbuilt structures that are in place, because of which the Afro-American can't quite get what he wants, and a lot of his dreams can't be achieved, and he has to those dreams they become dead. And his shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. So here you have shadow shouts. This is again another example of personification. So his shadow. So now it's very interesting that the word shadow has been used here. So the Afro-American is actually a living being. He has he has a physical being, but being in the cave for such a long time, that tends to affect his idea of himself, okay, or itself. That tends to affect the birds and in turn the Afro-American sense of self-identity. So from this particular word, the shadow, one can sense that the Afro-American is, because it has been enslaved, because it has been encaged within the bars of the cage, it is not quite itself. It is a lesser version of itself. So you can look at it that way. So his shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. So the life that the bird is living, that's not exactly a life. The bird is not exactly living. It's the free bird that's truly alive. It's the free bird that's really living. But this particular bird, for this bird's life, as he merely exists, this bird is not living, it's life. And so this bird's life has been reduced to the condition of a nightmare, which is like a terrible dream. Now, did this bird bring the nightmare onto itself? No, it did not. It was imposed on him by external circumstances. It was imposed. He was put into this cage. He was put into this situation out of no fault of his by the white man. So his shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. So here you have words like grave, here you have words like nightmare, here you have words like scream, you have a word like scream that, that goes on to show the pain of the bird that's there in the cage and the Afro-American who finds himself in such a part of such a system. And then again it's a repetition of lines. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. But despite the situation, despite the system being against him, despite centuries of oppression, despite centuries of being treated like animals, despite that, the Afro-American, the oppressed individual has the spirit, has the resilience to speak out, to voice its protest against this deep injustice that has been meted out to him over the course of time. And so we always perceive America as being a land of opportunity. Americans have always prided themselves on being the moral beacon of the world. America has always, obviously America is a superpower, but then one gets a sense of the troubled race relationship, or the troubled race relation that has existed between the Afro-Americans and the whites in America. And it's not only in that country that we have troubled race relationships, but in different parts of the world, and even in India, we have Indian society over centuries, even we have oppressed and we have discriminated against the Dalits. And they too are an oppressed community, and in fact a lot of poets and writers have spoken against this system where one entire community, one entire group of people are oppressed, are subjugated because of whatever reason. Let's not get into that. And then you have the sixth stanza. The sixth stanza is again a repetition, which is again, another literary device. Repetitions are used to put forth or to emphasize a point. So the sixth stanza basically goes on to capture the unbreakable will, the unbreakable spirit of the caged bird, and in turn the Afro-American. Having said that, I would want to stop right now. A few things that you need to remember. Remember the appropriateness of the title. That's important from your exam point of view. Remember the poetic devices. We've handled a few poetic devices. I spoke to you about juxtaposition. I spoke to you about personification. As far as the line length is concerned, there's not a fixed line length that this particular poem has. As far as the meter is concerned, there's no meter as such. As far as rhyming words are concerned, there are a few rhyming words. For example, you have, if you look at the second verse, you have the words cage and rage. These two words rhyme. In the third verse, you have trill, you have still, and you have hill. These words rhyme. And also, you have breeze and trees. Even these two words rhyme. As alliteration is concerned, alliteration, which is a repetition in sounds in a line. So you have the B of the word, the B of these, these in sounds. So this is an example of alliteration. And the fat worms waiting on a dawn bright lawn. You have W here. So that is another example of alliteration. And as far as the themes of this poem are concerned, I'm sure by now it's pretty obvious to you. You must have figured out the theme of this particular poem. You can look at it the way I see it. It's the number one theme that this particular poem has is freedom, and it is again the other theme you can the other theme could be oppression, and the poet beautifully captures the desire in every human being for freedom using the metaphor of the caged bird and the free bird. There is a lot more that I want to tell you, but then I think I will we'll wrap it up now. Kids, do focus on, and this is a shout out to A2 kids. Kids, do focus on The Merchant of Venice. Go through it, at least the acts that you already covered. Please go through it and stay in touch with English. And as far as this particular poem is concerned, you can go through your guidebook, go through your workbook. You can refer to the net if you want to, and jot down questions if you have any, so that when you return to school, you can ask me questions in class. And if there is any part that you've not understood, please do feel free to. You can text it to me. You can text your questions to me, or if you want to, I think the best thing would be for you to return and ask me these questions in class. That's it, and I wish you this thing. You have my best wishes. Stay safe and stay cool in the head, and please don't lose touch with and stay in touch with English. That's all. Goodbye, kids.